Hey friends, welcome to my channel and welcome to the third part of this topic, that is spinal cord. I hope you have watched the previous two videos in which I explained the basic external as well as the internal features of the spinal cord as well as the details regarding the transverse section of the spinal cord. In this video, we are going to mainly discuss about the ascending tracts of the spinal cord. So there are many ascending tracts, but for understanding purpose, we divide them into three categories. First is the tracts which are present in the anterior wide column. Second thing, the tracts which are present in the lateral wide column. And the third one, tracts which are present in the posterior wide column. So as I have discussed in my previous videos, that in the transverse section of the spinal cord, there are mainly two things. First is the gray matter, which is edge shaped, or I can say the butterfly shaped gray matter, which is present in the central area, and in the peripheral area there is white matter. In the white matter, we divide the tracts into three, that is anterior, lateral and the posterior one. So first we will understand the tracts which are present in the anterior white column. So let's start with the first tract, that is anterior spinothalamic tract. So you focus on the heading. First is anterior, second is spinothalamic, means it is between the spinal cord and reaching up to the thalamus, that is spinothalamic tract. And the tract, here the word tract is important because these are the tracts which carry the sensation from periphery to the center, which means they have sensory fibers, and the sensory fibers, they are like entering into the spinal cord as if they are entering into a bridge between the brain and the peripheral organs, or I can say the peripheral system. So spinal cord, it is like a bridge between these two, and that word tract which suggests this thing, that the sensations, they are reaching up to the brain via spinal cord. So let's get started with the first tract, that is the anterior spinothalamic tract. So as I have discussed in my previous video, that in the posterior gray horn there is one nucleus named as a chief sensory nucleus. I write it as a short form, that is the CSN, that the chief sensory nucleus. And suppose we are talking about the sixth thoracic segment. So from the chief sensory nucleus of this sixth thoracic segment, the tract originates and it ascend upward up to 2 to 3 segments. So it may ascend up to the T3 or the T4 level. Here it crosses the midline. So from the chief sensory nucleus of posterior gray horn of the right side, it may cross the midline, reaching up to the anterior white column of the T3 and the T4 of the left side of the spinal cord, or I can say the transverse section of the spinal cord. So from here, the tract which may ascend upwards, the tract may ascend upward in the spinal cord and reaches up to the thalamus. But in thalamus there is a particular area that it reaches up to the ventral postero-lateral nucleus of thalamus. Ventral postero-lateral nucleus of thalamus, or the VPL nucleus of the thalamus. So this is the first tract and the only tract which is present in the anterior white column. Next thing is about the lateral white column. In the lateral white column there are many tracts, but I am going to explain the 4 most important tracts which are present in the lateral column of the spinal cord. So the first thing, that is, as we know that there are marginal nucleus and the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando, which is present in the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. So let me write it over here. Suppose this is the marginal nucleus and this is the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. So from this, the tract which is originated, very easy to understand that this is the lateral spinothalamic tract. That this tract was anterior spinothalamic tract. Now here comes the lateral spinothalamic tract. So from the marginal nucleus and the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando, this tract is originated and it crosses the midline, reaching up to the lateral white column, and from here it goes upward in the lateral white column and reaches up to the VPL nucleus of thalamus. That is ventral postero-lateral nucleus of thalamus. Now you focus on one thing, that these are the tracts. Both tracts are ending at the same level, that anterior spinothalamic tract ending into the VPL nucleus and the lateral spinothalamic tract also ending into the VPL of the thalamus. From here, both tracts are going upwards into the sensory cortex. They are going to the sensory cortex, but they carry different sensations. You may imagine that the only difference in the neuroanatomy of both of these tracts is that the nucleus and the column, that is the only difference. But the sensation which is carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract, which is the crude touch and for the lateral spinothalamic tract, the sensation, that is the pain and temperature, that is carried by the lateral spinothalamic tract. Now comes the the second tract of the lateral white column, that is ventral spinocerebellar tract and the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Now again focus on the heading, that the ventral and the dorsal spinocerebellar means these tracts are ending into the cerebellum, or they are reaching up to the cerebellum. And these are the tracts, that the ventral spinocerebellar tract, it is getting originated from the marginal nucleus, that is on the periphery portion of the posterior gray horn. Ventral spinocerebellar tract, it has both crossed fibers as well as the uncrossed fibers. Till now we are discussing about only the crossed fibers, means they are crossing the midline. But here for the ventral spinocerebellar, it has both crossed as well as the uncrossed fibers, and these fibers carry the proprioceptive sensation from the muscles, from the ligaments, from the muscles, joints. All of these are carried by the ventral spinocerebellar tract. So from here it may go upward from the same side, as well as it also crosses the midline and going up to the lateral white column. From here it reaches up to the superior cerebellar peduncle. Let me write it over here. Reaches up to the superior cerebellar peduncle. Superior cerebellar peduncle and ending into the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, that is the anterior lobe of cerebellum. So this was the tract of ventral spinocerebellar tract ending into the cerebellum. Next tract which is present, that is the dorsal. So for the dorsal, let me change the color of my marker, that the dorsal spinocerebellar. So the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, which is also responsible for carrying the proprioceptive as well as the subconscious kinesthetic sensation. So, and which is getting originated from the dorsal nucleus of Clark, also present in the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. that is the dorsal nucleus of Clark. I write it as a short form, that is the DNC, dorsal nucleus of Clark, and it is also crossing the fibers, crossing the midline, and goes upwards in the lateral wide column, reaching up to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and ending into the lobe of cerebellum. So I can say there are three tracts which we have discussed in the lateral wide column. So the first thing, that is the lateral spinothalamic tract, carrying the pain as well as the temperature sensation. Next thing is the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Let me write it over here, that this is the ventral spinocerebellar tract, carrying the proprioceptive fibers, from the muscles, joints, and the particular level, which if I mention that for the ventral spinocerebellar, it arises from the lower lumbar segments, and for the dorsal, that is here, it arises from the dorsal nucleus of Clark. So the name is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Spinocerebellar tract, also responsible for carrying the subconscious kinesthetic sensation. So the three tracts carrying the different sensation, only present in the lateral wide column of the spinal cord. And the last one, and my favorite tract, that is the spinoreticular tract. Here you can see the one structure, which is the reticular formation, which is present in the brain. This is the reticular formation. And I mentioned in my previous video that in the lateral horn, which is a very small projection which is present, starting from the first thoracic to the second lumbar segment, it contains cluster of neuron, which is known as an intermediolateral nucleus. So the spinocerebellar tract, which is uncrossed, as well as it originates from the intermediolateral nucleus present in the lateral horn, and it is reaching up to the level of reticular formation, and which is responsible for the consciousness and the awareness of our body. That is this typical sensation which is carried by the spinoreticular tract. Let me write it over here, that is the spinoreticular tract, for the consciousness and the awareness. Last thing, and the most important thing, that is the posterior column tracts. So the posterior column tracts, these are the tracts, they carry multiple sensations. If I give you the example, that it carries the sensation of vibration, it carries the sensation of stereognosis, it carries the sensation of tactile localization, tactile discrimination, and the most important thing, that is lesion of this tract carries the multiple disabilities. So very much important to understand posterior wide column tract, also known as the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis, or the third name, that is the tract of goll and burdach. So the tract of goll and burdach, in which first we need to focus on a little bit anatomy of the transverse section of the spinal cord. That if I focus on this much quadrant of the transverse section of the spinal cord, so if I zoom it, then it appears like this. So this area, remember I explained that this septum is known as an posterior median septum, which divides the posterior wide column into right as well as the left half. This is known as an posterior intermediate septum. So in the posterior intermediate septum, which creates two areas. One is the medial, this is the medial area, and this is the lateral area. So in the medial area lies the fasciculus gracilis or the fasciculus gracilis, and in the lateral area lies the fasciculus cuneatus. And this fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, they are mainly formed by the posterior nerve root ganglia. Means the sensations which are from the lower half of the body and the upper half of the body, they are reaching up to the posterior nerve root ganglia, and they are reaching up to the medial one, that is the fasciculus gracilis, mainly receiving impulses from the lower extremities or the lower half of the body. Fasciculus cuneatus, which is situated laterally, carries the sensation from the upper half or the upper limb of the body. So the fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, they ascend upwards in the same column, that is the posterior wide column, and let me draw it over here. They ascend upwards in the posterior wide column, reaching up to the level of medulla oblongata, that is here is the medulla oblongata. Here it terminates in a very particular nucleus. Fasciculus gracilis terminate in the nucleus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus terminate in the nucleus cuneatus. From here they ascend upwards, they crosses the midline and forming the internal arcuate fibers. And they are going upwards. And ending into the sensory cortex. So they are ending into the sensory cortex of the cerebral cortex. This was all about the ascending tracts of the spinal cord. If you like my videos, do like, share and subscribe. Do share these videos maximum, and if you are having any doubts regarding the tracts, its origin, function, do let me know in the comment section. Till then, keep learning, keep exploring, share these videos maximum so that one can understand the topic in a better way. Thank you so much.